Good morning, everyone. My name is Deborah Uber, the Education Coordinator for the Embryo Adoption Awareness Center. We are happy to have you all here this morning, and I'm very pleased to bring you our newest webinar that focuses on the legal status of embryo adoption. This morning, we have Alyssa Trammell-McDonald joining us as our presenter. Alyssa is the team lead for the Snowflake's Embryo Adoption Program, and she oversees the legal aspects of the program, helping to finalize contracts and oversee shipments for families in the Snowflake's program. Alyssa was recently invited to share this presentation at the AATB conference in Scottsdale, Arizona, and we are very excited to have her present it for us this morning as well. Now, before we get started, I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping. During the presentation, all participants will be in a listen-only mode. There will be a question and answer session at the end of the presentation using the questions you submit through the Q&A feature. You may submit your questions at any time during the session, and we will answer as many as possible at the end of the presentation. To ask a question, simply click on the Q&A panel on the lower right-hand portion of the screen, type your question into the dialog box, and click the Send button. If you happen to be in the full screen view, you can click on the question mark icon on the toolbar on the lower right-hand corner of the screen. This will open up the Q&A panel on your screen only. When you submit your question, it will be visible to all of the panelists, but not visible to other attendees. We expect the presentation to last approximately 45 minutes with 15 minutes for questions. We will be distributing a copy of today's presentation and a comprehensive list of any answers to questions submitted today during the webinar. If you experience any technical difficulties during the presentation, please contact WebEx Technical Support at 866-229-3239. And just as a quick reminder, this presentation is being recorded today. All right, Alyssa, I will go ahead and hand it over to you.
All right, Deb, thank you so much. Thank you so much for the introduction. As Deb mentioned, I help oversee the legal aspects of the process in the Snowflakes program and also help with the clinic coordination and the process of getting the embryos from one location to another. I did recently give this discussion in Scottsdale, Arizona, and we just figured it would be helpful for other people to get an overview on the legal status of embryo donation in the United States. In addition to that, we will also be talking about how various organizations are working together to help fertility clinics navigate not only the legal aspects, but the medical aspects as well, including the FDA requirements for embryo donation. Finally, we'll be closing this presentation with discussing why more families are choosing to move forward with donation and adoption for their embryo disposition choice. First, I'd like to give a little bit of history as far as why is this even an issue? What's the point of discussing embryo disposition if it's not that big of a deal? So just a little bit of back history before we dive into the meat of this presentation. IVF yields a large number of embryos to give families the opportunity for multiple transfers without having to go through the egg collection process multiple times. Then all of the eggs are fertilized and the remaining embryos are stored and cryopreserved for future use. Up until 2011, there weren't really any specific numbers as far as how many of these frozen embryos existed in the United States. There had been some earlier studies from nearly 10 years before that had fairly small numbers, but when you looked at the numbers of families choosing to participate in vitro fertilization process and how that had gone up over the years, there wasn't a tangible answer of how many frozen embryos were currently in storage and how that number had increased as the number of families utilizing IVF had increased. So in 2011, a census was conducted during which every fertility clinic in the United States was contacted. Now, some chose not to respond to that, but from the information gathered and those that did choose to respond, it was found that there are over 600,000 frozen embryos remaining in storage in the United States. Now, that number is 4 years old at this point, and some people are saying that number may now even be closer to 1 million, but the last tangible number we have from the census is 600,000 embryos in frozen storage. As I mentioned before, the number of individuals utilizing IVF grows each year, and with that, it can be assumed that the number of frozen embryos is growing as well. So that brings up the question of what is the legal status of these embryos? There's 600,000 of them, so that's a pretty big question. And what are they? Are they property? Are they people? How are we going to handle that moving forward? From the legal perspective, it has been decided that embryos are considered property, with the owner being the person who had the embryos created. So the ownership is not determined by the genetic relation of the embryos, but who had the embryos created. So the family may have utilized an anonymous egg donor or an anonymous sperm donor. However, those embryos are their personal property since they intended to use those embryos for their own family building efforts. With that in mind, the donation of embryos is considered an exchange of property. There are a few states that have specific legislation pertaining to embryo donation, but overall in the United States, a transfer of embryos from one party to another is considered a property transfer. In the state of Georgia, families do have the option of finalizing the embryo adoption in court. This is not a requirement by any means, but families may go to the court to have this adoption confirmed. This is an extra step because typically the purpose of having a traditional domestic or international adoption confirmed in court is to have both parents, both adopting parents, have their names placed on the birth certificate rather than the birth parent of that child. However, with embryo donation in the United States, the woman who gives birth to a child is legally considered the mother, regardless of genetic relation to the child. And whoever that woman is married to is considered the legal father of that child. Therefore, if a family does receive donated embryos, their name will go straight on the birth certificate, and there isn't a need for this extra step of having the adoption confirmed in court, but some families do choose to take advantage of this option simply to make sure they have a very clear outline of who has the parental rights over these children. In California, it's a legal requirement that clinics have to provide timely education on what families can do with their remaining embryos. Now, all clinics will give these options to their patients at the time that the embryos are created, but California has taken that extra step by making it a legal requirement that families know what they can do with their remaining embryos. In Louisiana, they have a few additional laws. Embryos are considered juridical persons and can be made available for adoptive implantation. So the embryos have a little bit of extra legal status in the state of Louisiana, and families aren't given the option of destroying their embryos in that state. Now, as you can imagine, with 600,000 embryos in storage and all of the families that those embryos represent, there can be some disputes over what will happen with the remaining embryos and who has the right to make those decisions. Primarily, those can come up when the unexpected in life happens. Maybe a couple divorces or they decide to break up, and that now raises the question of what do we do with these frozen embryos. Some of you may have heard the more recent highly publicized cases of celebrities with remaining embryos deciding what to be done with those. Typically, from case law, we see that primarily there is no forced reproduction, meaning that in most cases, the court will favor the party who is not wanting to have a child from those embryos. All of these have just been handled on a case-by-case basis in the court system. There hasn't been any law passed by states regarding who gets to make that ultimate decision. They continue to view them as private property and handle it as a property dispute in courts. So now that we've covered that these are private property belonging to the parties who had the embryos created, what can these parties do with them? So as I mentioned, clinics review disposition options with their patients prior to embryo creation. They will talk with their patients and address the possibility of remaining embryos and ask them what they would like done with those. So their options are, they have several options for what to do with their embryos. They can thaw and discard the embryos. They can continue storage indefinitely, which may have financial repercussions, as clinics are typically charging between $300 and several $1,000s per year for ongoing storage for embryos. They can choose to donate the embryos to science, which will result in the destruction of embryos. Or they can choose to donate for reproduction, meaning they will donate them to another couple who's hoping to grow their family through donated embryos. Here we have a quote from Dr. Mark Sauer saying, "Couples don't always agree about the moral and legal status of an embryo, where life begins and how religion enters into it, and a lot of them end up kicking the can down the road." So many families will have this discussion with their fertility clinic, about what will be done with remaining embryos, but frankly, that's not at the front of their mind. They are focused on having a baby. They are focused on their fertility treatments. And so the decision of remaining embryos is seen as not today's problem. We can worry about that at a later date. I've talked to multiple families who've shared that their child was so wanted and they were so invested in growing their family through in vitro that even the idea of having remaining embryos at the end, the idea of having an unwanted embryo was just completely unfathomable to them. They were placing all of their hope in these embryos they were creating and could not imagine a day or a time where they wouldn't want every single one of those embryos. And so many couples will sign off on the disposition choice without really giving as much thought to the ramifications of their choice. They may opt for discarding, they may opt for ongoing storage without thinking logistically what the implications of that decision are. So when are these choices made? The couple may have pushed off these options, but there eventually comes a point where families will need to make a decision with their remaining embryos. As I mentioned, some families who are choosing to store indefinitely, they will have a financial incentive to make a decision. So many families will call us saying, you know what, the annual bill is due again, we just can't continue to cover this. It's becoming unreasonable for us, especially as some clinics will schedule their fees to increase exponentially as more and more time goes on to encourage the family to make some kind of disposition choice for their embryos. So sometimes the decision can be financially motivated, or at least that can be the catalyst that moves them towards making a decision. Another time that families will choose to make a decision about their remaining embryos after their own family is complete. They may have had several transfers, several children, and they are looking at their family and they just know, you know what, this is it. This is our family. This is all we can provide for, and we feel like at this point we're good, and we don't have room to account for these additional embryos that we still have in storage. There may be other things that come up. As I mentioned with the legal aspect of things, families may divorce, there could be a death in the family, and for those reasons they are not choosing to move forward with transferring the embryos themselves and using the embryos for their own family building purposes. So out of this, the families may choose one of the 4 disposition options that I mentioned earlier. They can discard them, they can donate them to science, they can continue to store them, or they can donate them for reproductive purposes. Now, donating their embryos for reproductive purposes, the history of that is about as long as the history of in vitro fertilization. So since it was discovered embryos could be frozen and stored indefinitely, that brought up the question of, well, could we transfer these into a woman who's not genetically related to the child? And the answer to that is yes. So embryo donation has actually been around since the 80s. The first legal writing on embryo donation is recorded in 1986 in the Southern California Law Review. Now, this was a donation process, and we're going to get into the distinction between donation and adoption in a little bit. But then later, some programs came and decided to apply adoption principles to the embryo donation process, meaning they would apply the best practices of adoption to the process of matching a donor family with intended parents. Now, the Snowflake's embryo donation program was actually the first program to pioneer this way of doing embryo donation. It was established almost 20 years ago in 1997. So what's the difference between terminology? What's the difference between the word donation and adoption? This can be somewhat of a hot button issue, as a lot of clinics are hesitant to consider this an adoption because the legal repercussions of that would be very serious. They would have a lot of impacts for it. And also, on the flip side, some families are not comfortable with the word donation and implying that these embryos are just property. So it can be a little bit of a loaded issue. What we're talking about today is not a case for personhood or getting into the philosophy behind those, but rather viewing the word donation and the word adoption as descriptive terms only, not legal terms. So donation is through a fertility clinic. This would be the anonymous donation to a recipient couple. So in a donation case that is handled by a fertility clinic, as I mentioned, they're primarily anonymous. Generally, there's no information or tracking of genetic siblings and no emergency medical contacts. Now, some clinics do have an exception to this and allow for some contact between the families, but for the most part, it's an anonymous donation, and there's not the option for contact with the donor family down the road in case medical concerns arise, the family will fill out a medical questionnaire about their background and their history, and the recipient family will get that information, but that's it. It's a one-time exchange of information rather than an ongoing relationship between the two families. Oftentimes, there can be long waiting lists for donated embryos at fertility clinics as well. The demand is a lot higher than the supply of families comfortable with donating their embryos. And from a clinic perspective, it's viewed primarily as a medical procedure. The clinic is helping the family to pursue a fertility treatment and grow their family through embryo donation. Now, an adoption model is when an adoption agency applies the best practices of adoption in the placement of embryos. This was started out of the philosophy that adoption agencies have been around for hundreds of years, and we've had hundreds of years to learn from our mistakes and to hone this process and really determine what is the best way of caring for the family and the children in this process. And though these embryos are, from a legal perspective, property, the end result that is hoped for is the birth of a child, which is the same, which comes with the same questions that can often come from adoption with, okay, how did I come to be a part of this family? What's my story? So adoption agencies apply their best practices to this process. So it seeks to meet the emotional and social need of the donor, the adopter, and also the children that result from this embryo donation and adoption. Another difference is because these programs are not geographically limited as a clinic program may be, there tend to be more embryos available and there is either no waiting list or a shorter waiting list to receive embryos through an adoption program. So there's pros and cons to each, just like one solution for embryo donation or embryo disposition will not be right for every single family. There is no program that's right for every single family. So I feel like it would just be helpful to outline the differences between the donation process and the adoption process so you can help guide your families and your patients to make the decision that is best for them. So going back to donation for reproduction through a fertility clinic, as we mentioned, it's an anonymous donation through a clinic, primarily treated as a medical procedure. Some of the pros of this is that FDA compliance is more straightforward. The fertility clinic is handling all of the information themselves. They are completing the screening of the donor family, which entails doing lab work and doing questionnaires just to assess if the family has any risk factors that may present a risk to the family who is receiving those embryos. It can mean less work for donor families as well. The family choosing to donate their embryos anonymously typically can make an appointment with their clinic and come in just for a single day, complete that blood work, complete any counseling that may be necessary, complete the questionnaires, and then sign off on the embryos and give the clinic control over the matching process. So for some families, this can be an easier option because it doesn't require as much emotional involvement going through the process. And for some families who've already been through so much, that can be somewhat of a relief that they won't be invested in this process over months and months, but rather go in, get it taken care of in a day, and then be done. Also, it can be less expensive since there are less moving pieces to coordinate. The process of going through a fertility clinic to receive donated embryos can be less expensive than an adoption model. Some of the cons of this model, though, is that some families may not be eligible to donate their embryos. Different clinics have different requirements on which donated embryos will be accepted into their program. Some clinics may be more open while others are more specific. Some may have a minimum number of embryos that must be donated, so a clinic may require that a family donating their embryos donates no less than 4 embryos. So families that only have 3 embryos remaining will not be eligible, even though there's no medical concerns or any reason that these embryos wouldn't be considered viable. So that can put some families in a little bit of a tough spot if they don't have a number that's desirable for their clinic. Another con can be that the genetic sibling set of embryos may be divided up. So if a family is donating a larger number of embryos, say they have 8 embryos remaining, that may be split between 2 families, which can result in genetic siblings being spread over multiple families. Also, there's no legal requirement for permanent record storage. Most agencies operating off of an adoption model are applying that best practice of permanent record storage and permanent sibling tracking to their process, whereas with fertility clinics, there's not a legal requirement for them to keep track of all of the embryos that have been donated, what the medical outcomes were of those, and if any health issues came up with the genetic siblings. Many clinics do choose to track that, though. One of the final cons is that the patient or the donor may not have knowledge of the recipient family, and the recipient may not have any knowledge of the donor. So this means the family donating their embryos is not entitled to know if the transfer resulted in a birth. They may not know how many children were born. They may not know anything about the recipient family that received their embryos. So for a lot of donor families, this can be the linchpin that leads them to choose an adoption model because they want some answers. They want some closure. They want to know if a child was born, and they want to know that that child is doing well. So oftentimes families will choose to go with the adoption model because as I've heard some families explain to me, you know what, every time I went to the grocery store, if I saw a child between this age and this age, I would wonder if they were actually genetically my child. So some families have a very hard time with that unknown element of an anonymous donation through a fertility clinic. Another aspect is, since clinics are geographically limited typically with their clientele, the likelihood that they would be in the same geographic vicinity of any of their children that resulted from an embryo donation can be a little bit more difficult for families too that don't want to have that interaction. So moving along to donation for reproduction through an agency where an adoption model is applied. Some of the pros of this is the donor is empowered to choose the recipient. So much as an adoption agency allows the expectant mother to choose which family will receive her baby through a domestic adoption, the embryo donor is empowered to choose which adoptive family will receive their embryos through this process. So the donor is allowed to determine criteria for the adoptive family. They can say, I would like the family to have this level of education. I would like them to be married for this amount of time. I would like them to practice this religion. I am comfortable with them already having this many children in the home. And they can set an outline for what type of family they are comfortable with receiving their embryos. Additionally, both families are encouraged to have communication with one another. So the families will create something called a family profile, which is very similar to a donor profile, but in some ways does offer a little bit more information. They complete information about who they are, how their family came to be, how they came to have remaining embryos, what their values are. And similarly, the adoptive family will complete a family profile as well, explaining who they are, what their values are, and what they're hoping to accomplish through embryo adoption. And during the matching process, the families get to exchange these family profiles and get to know each other a little bit before making a decision on who will be receiving their embryos. It's a mutual selection process. So first, the donor family will get to review the adoptive family's profile and determine whether or not they're comfortable with the match. And they get to make that first decision. And assuming that they are comfortable with that match, then the adoptive family gets to review their family profile and also their medical history and make a decision of whether or not they're comfortable with the match. So both families are equally involved in the matching process with the adoption model applied. Another difference is that all donated embryos are given to one recipient family, with the goal being to keep genetic siblings in groups in the fewest number of families possible. So even if a couple has 6 to 8 embryos remaining from their in vitro fertilization process, all 6 or all 8 of those embryos will be placed with the same adoptive family. And then that adoptive family can have a transfer and then continue to store the remaining embryos for future transfer attempts. So giving families the chance to build their entire family with a related sibling group. We've had some families that have had multiple snowflakes children from the same embryo set, allowing their children to be fully genetic siblings and keep the number of embryos spread throughout multiple families down to a minimum. Another thing is permanent record storage. We keep track of each and every embryo in our program. We know which embryo has gone where and to what family. We also have the adoptive families check in with us once a year for the first 5 years to let us know how their family is doing. Additionally, if the genetic family or the donor family wanted updates on how any children are doing, we give our families the option of communicating with one another. Now, they may have either direct communication, so the families may exchange email addresses or phone numbers to talk directly with one another, or they may opt for the more common semi-open adoption program where the agency is mediating the contact, but on an annual or semi-annual basis, the adoptive family is sending in updates on how any children born through embryo adoption are doing, and we share those updates with the donor family if those updates are desired. On top of all this, we also have a strong focus on the education of the adoptive family. and teaching them how to communicate with their children. We don't want this to be an overwhelming process or something that they're ashamed of and they feel like they need to keep a secret from their adopted children, but rather we want to empower families to tell their children the amazing story of how they came to be a part of their family, how the donor family loved them so much that they gave them this chance, and how the adoptive family loved them so much that they sought them out in this way. And we give our families the means and the vocabulary to explain that to any child born from embryo adoption in an age-appropriate manner so that they can present their story in a positive and joyful light. There are some downsides to this program, though. There are more moving pieces due to the need to address social and emotional issues along with medical treatments. So a lot of what I've talked about in the pros is more of an adoption process. There's more focus on that social element of the embryo donation. But we recognize this is also a medical procedure. The donor families have to go through medical screening. The fertility clinic has to receive all of the records on the embryos if they're receiving embryos from an outside clinic in order to perform a successful transfer. So with that, there's a lot more coordination rather than an anonymous donation at a clinic where all of the embryology reports are already in the same spot. We have to gather all of that information from the clinic that originally created the embryos and then facilitate that information being given to the recipient family's clinic as well. We also have to coordinate the screening of donors and make sure that they are completing that blood work, that they are answering the risk assessment questionnaires. And as such, with there being more moving pieces, the process can be a little bit lengthier because we are working with multiple parties rather than just one fertility clinic. On that note, it can be more expensive. So once you're considering working with the clinics, once you're considering shipping the embryos from one clinic to another, and you're also taking into account ongoing communication, which we have facilitated for some families for over 15 years now. So when you're looking at the time and the effort that goes into that, it does result in there being a higher cost for doing an embryo adoption through an agency. One of the other cons is that a child is not a guaranteed outcome. We wish every single one of our adoptive families could take home a snowflake's baby at the end of the day, but there are certain things that are simply outside of our control. So as compared to other clinic models or even other forms of adoption, there is no guarantee of a child. Whereas some fertility clinics may have a process where they have a guarantee where if you don't have a child in X amount of transfers, they will either reimburse you or there is some mitigating program for that. We do offer discounted rematching fees to recognize that some families may not get pregnant from their first set of embryos, but may just need another chance with another set of embryos. But again, we cannot guarantee that every family will bring home a baby at the end of the day. Another side note here is that some families will self-match, and they may use, there are certain websites out there that allow families to find out about donors and adoptive families on their own. So families may find out about each other through a variety of means. Some families find each other on Facebook, and then choose to work with an agency or a lawyer to assist with that process. So they may have found each other on their own, but then come to a lawyer or an agency for help with the legal contracts and also with the clinic coordination if they're transporting the embryos from one clinic to another. So that's a modified option that is available for some families as well. So I talked a little bit about the FDA requirements, about what organizations do to help fertility clinics with these requirements. To go into that in a little bit more detail, agencies work closely with fertility clinic personnel to ensure FDA compliance. What we do when we start working with a new clinic is we send them a questionnaire and ask, what is your interpretation of the FDA? Because some of the ways that the FDA defines donor, anonymous donor, a directed donation is somewhat vague in the exact wording of the FDA's outline of that. So clinics are given some leeway to interpret them themselves and come up with their own standard operating procedure for how they want to handle donated embryos in their fertility clinic. So as such, when we begin working with a fertility clinic, we will ask them what their requirements are so we can help them adhere to those, and we can help make sure that the genetic family or the donor family is taking those steps to complete the necessary screening process that's required by the recipient clinic. We help bridge the gaps between the initial screening that was completed when the family was originally planning to use the embryos themselves and now the more detailed requirements for an anonymous embryo donation. So typically families will have to do more detailed blood work, they'll have to do a risk assessment questionnaire, and also complete a physical just to determine that there are no factors that would immediately bar them from donating their embryos to an adopted family. According to ASRM, there was an 82% increase in the number of donated embryo transfers from 2009 to 2013. So that number is continuing to increase. So as that number increases, more agencies, more organizations, and more clinics are wanting to become involved in that process. But why are more families choosing that option? Why are we seeing that number going up? We have a quote from a family here just saying that they were told that their options were to donate the embryos for scientific research or just to thaw them and let them go. But none of those options worked for us, as they said. They said, then we discovered the Snowflake's embryo adoption and we knew that that was it. A lot of families describe finding out about directed donation through an adoption agency and hearing that option and having it just click for them, that this is the right answer for their remaining embryos. Some reasons that contribute to families having the sense that this is the right option for them is that the embryos were originally created by these patients for life. So some families have said, you know what, we didn't really think of them as more than a little ball of cells when we first created these embryos, but then we put everything in these embryos. These embryos were our hope for a family for us in the future. And now I've got a precocious 3-year-old daughter who has a sassy sense of humor and is all over the place. And I know that she came from that same embryo as the sibling set that we still have remaining in storage. And with that, we just can't in good conscience discard them. Other families may do it for more altruistic reasons. They've been through their own infertility journey and they can empathize with families in the midst of their own infertility journey, and they want to help another couple who's trying to have a family of their own. So with that, a lot of families will choose to donate for reproductive purposes. Something that's helpful in this is that there's no expiration date on embryos. So there have been children born from embryos that were frozen for over 15 years. So some families that may not have known this option was available and continue to store indefinitely can then choose to donate their embryos 5, 10, 15 years down the road when they find out that this option is available for them. With an adoption program model, donors are given whatever degree of input they desire for their embryo donation. So this can help put families at ease too as they begin to navigate this somewhat unknown path that they may not be familiar with or may have just heard of. So with that, we can see there's a variety of reasons that families are choosing to donate their embryos. They are considered legal property, so the families are given that right to make that decision themselves of what is the best disposition choice for them and for their family. And with that in mind, various organizations are coming forward to help families navigate this process. As I mentioned, there's no one-size-fits-all for our families. What is the right disposition option for one family may not be a good fit for others, but we should be doing our best to educate families on their full array of options. And as agencies come forward, I know there is a desire to work with fertility clinics to help them meet their FDA requirements for the embryo donation. So moving forward, I think this presentation has shown how embryo donation can be a mutually beneficial process that serves both clients and clinics. For clients and patients, it offers families with remaining embryos an option that they may not have heard of for their remaining embryos, an option that lines up with their beliefs or their value system. It gives them an option to be involved in the disposition of these embryos. It gives them the option of knowing what happened to these donated embryos and knowing if a child resulted and potentially even having communication with the adoptive family. And then obviously for intended parents or adoptive families, this can be the answer to prayers. This can be their means of growing their family. This can be the way that they move forward and have children. And then also for fertility clinics, this answers the question of the growing number of embryos in storage. As I mentioned, there were 600,000 embryos in 2011, and that number continues to grow. So we need to continue to give patients and clients options for what to do with those remaining embryos so they can reach a decision. So we don't see the number of abandoned embryos continuing to increase in the United States. So on that note, for fertility clinics, I would just encourage you to continue to keep good records on families with remaining embryos. The embryos don't have an expiration date, but it can be very difficult to facilitate a donation when there are not clear records on the embryology report on the screening process that was completed on the embryos at the time of creation. Additionally, you can continue to educate clients and patients on their full array of disposition options. You can let them know they do have choices and they do have the option of having control over where their embryos go. And for adoption agencies, you can let families know that this adoption option is available to them. They may have only been considering a domestic infant adoption or FOS adopt or international adoption, but this option is available to them as well if they want the experience of carrying a pregnancy and experiencing that gestational bonding and getting to know the full gestational history of their child. I know that this is a lot of information and that it may seem overwhelming to keep track of all this. As a fertility clinic, you've got a million other things going on and a lot of other priorities as you move forward. Same thing goes for adoption agencies. You have other programs, other clients demanding your attention, and we know that you probably don't have time to be an expert on every option available to families. So we have compiled a small list of resources here for you to either explore yourself or direct your families to. The Embryo Adoption Awareness Center received grants from the federal government for the express purpose of educating couples on their options for remaining embryos, and specifically expanding on embryo adoption and what that entails and what families' options are. There's quite a few resources here, educational resources, there's webinars, videos, there's tables that lay out different programs. That's very helpful for getting your bearings in this conversation. There's also a website, Building Blocks to Baby Steps. There's a very handy spreadsheet on this website that outlines the different agencies participating in embryo adoption programs and clearly outlines what services they offer, who they will work with, who they won't work with, as just a quick at a glance what your patient's options are. And then finally, there's the Pathway to Family magazine. This is a magazine for fertility and adoption that comes out twice per year with articles on the openness model that can be applied to embryo donation, different fertility treatment options, and also just lifestyle choices and advice for families that are seeking to grow their families currently. All three of these are great resources, as I said, either for yourselves or for your patients and clients going forward. And it is my hope that with these resources, you can feel empowered to educate patients and clients towards making the decision that is the best for them and their family. And that wraps up our presentation. Thank you so much for your time and taking some time out of your busy schedule to go over these. I believe we'll go into the questions now at this point.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Alyssa. That was really, really great. I already even see some questions coming in, so I'm going to just quickly switch it over. If you'd like to ask questions about this presentation or just in general, then you can go ahead and just follow these directions to submit a question. We have a couple coming in already. And while you are working on that, I'm also going to just update you guys on a couple future events that we have coming that you might be interested in. So I know we have a couple home study or a couple adoption agencies here today, and so on Wednesday, November 11th at 10 a.m. Mountain Time, it's Mountain Time for me, so that's what I put in, we have a webinar about conducting a home study for embryo adoption. And so this is just going to review some of the information that you may need for completing a home study if you're working with families that are considering embryo adoption, and how to adjust that home study so that it fits with those families and with the embryo adoption process. So there's some education that goes along with that. So we're going to be presenting that again on Wednesday, November 11th. And then on Wednesday, December 2nd, we have Daniel Nerbeth. He is the director of Nightlight Christian Adoptions. He's going to be sharing on Protestantism and embryo adoption. And so this is kind of tailing off of a webinar that we had in the past about the Roman Catholic conversation for embryo adoption. And we'd love to have you guys join us for that as well. And then again, just to, like Alyssa was sharing, we have our latest educational tool, the magazine Pathway to Family. You can check that out as a website, www.pathwaytofamily.org. And so I'm going to go ahead and jump over to questions that we have coming in. All right, the first one that we have is the psychological screening for embryo donor and embryo recipients required, or is it suggested?
So for the screening for embryo donors is suggested. A lot of our families that are in the donation process are wanting to complete the process as quickly as possible and may choose not to move forward if it were a complete requirement that they undergo detailed psychological screening. However, if the clinic receiving the embryos requires that, we will ask the family to complete this step, but that's on a case-by-case basis. As far as the recipient family, they do complete screening. They actually undergo a home study, which involves meeting with a licensed social worker several times over the course of a few months. That also involves educating the family on the process of embryo adoption, how to explain to their children how they came to be, and also exploring their views on parenting, how they've processed through their own infertility journey, working through why they've chosen to move forward with embryo adoption specifically, and really going into all of that. The end result is a typically around 10-page long report on the family. During this process, they're also completing background checks and screenings too, to make sure there's nothing of concern that would bring into question their ability to provide a safe and loving home for a child. So oftentimes the home study process ends up actually being quite a bit more detailed than just a single meeting with a psychologist or a therapist, but it does have the same outcome of discussing what the ramifications of embryo adoption are and making sure the family is in an emotionally healthy spot to be moving forward with this option, and also that they've considered all the different facets that go into the process.
Okay, great. All right, our second question, it's pretty simple. Would it be possible to obtain a copy of the slides? And the answer is yes, I can answer that. After this webinar, I will actually be typing up any questions and answers that were asked during this presentation, and I send out in a follow-up email to anyone that has registered for the webinar. So you'll get a copy of the slides, written answers to any questions asked during the presentation, and a link to the recording of this webinar. We also share our webinars on the Embryo Adoption Awareness Center website. It's under Webinar Archives, so if you would like to share it to any family or friends, you can do that. So you can find it on the Webinar Archives. Okay, it looks like we have another question. Let me read it real quick. Okay, so the person asking the question is the Executive Director of Colorado Christian Services. They are a licensed child placement agency in Centennial, Colorado, and they have experience conducting family assessments specifically for embryo adoption. How can they get on the referral lists? And I can actually talk to you directly as well, Alyssa, unless you had anything additional to add to that.
No, you can go ahead and address it.
Okay. I'll just go ahead and send you a follow-up email after this webinar, and we can discuss that and get your information. Okay. All right. I am not seeing any other questions coming in.
I have a few more that have come up.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so let me go back up to the top. I think we may have missed a few. One of the questions raised was, if all embryos from the donating family are given to one family, what happens to any embryos that are left over once the recipient family is finished creating their family? That's a great question. One of the questions we ask recipient families when they're starting our process is how many children they're hoping to have through embryo donation or embryo adoption. And so, for example, if a couple is saying, you know what, we only want one child, maybe 2 children max, we will try to match them with a genetic family or a donor family that has a smaller sibling set of embryos. But if a family is donating a larger number of embryos, say 10 or 12 embryos, we will try to match that family with an adoptive family who has expressed interest in having multiple children through embryo adoption. So, for example, we would probably match them with a couple in their mid-20s who has expressed interest in having a large family. That being said, though, we are not in complete control, and sometimes families will get pregnant with triplets on their first transfer and for understandable reasons feel that their family is complete after that, or maybe choose to have only one more child after that, leaving some remaining embryos. At that point, we do ask that the family return the embryos to the control of the original donor family, and then we'll match those remaining embryos with a subsequent adoptive family. We try to avoid those scenarios as much as we can, but by handling it on a one-at-a-time basis, rather than immediately breaking up a set of 12 embryos into 2 sibling sets of 6, we just take it one family at a time so that couple can go through as many embryos as they desire and then place the remaining embryos with a subsequent family. Like I said, those situations are rare and we try to avoid it, but that is the plan we have in place, and that's what we help families with in the event that there are remaining embryos after the first adoptive family feels their family is complete. So that's one way we handle this remaining embryos question. Another question that came up was that I mentioned that we asked clinics what their interpretations of the FDA regulations and screening is. The example given was if embryos were created with a patient whose Hep C was positive, but their Hep C PCR was negative, would those embryos be accepted at Snowflakes? The short answer is yes, Snowflakes will accept all embryos, but we recognize that not all clinics will accept our embryos. So we would accept a donor family into the program that had those results, and then we would work on matching them with an adoptive family whose fertility clinic was comfortable with accepting those embryos in. Different clinics have different protocols that they'll follow for that. Some may accept them into their program and store them under quarantine or ship them back out to a long-term storage immediately after the transfer is performed. Other ones will just have the adoptive family undergo additional counseling to make sure they understand any risk factors associated with that, but we would only place those embryos with a family whose clinic was comfortable with accepting those into their fertility clinic. So we will take them, but then it'll be on a case-by-case basis which clinic would be comfortable with accepting those embryos. All infectious disease screening results and the questionnaire is sent to the adoptive family's clinic before the match is finalized to ensure that their fertility clinic is indeed comfortable with these specific embryos that the family is receiving. Okay, and then another question, what are the legal implications that clinics should be thinking about when implementing an embryo donation program? If you are implementing it yourself or working with an agency, that can affect what your process looks like. One of the biggest ones that you just want to consider is, are you being compliant with FDA requirements? So you just want to make sure that you have a standard operating procedure in place for how you handle and how you screen incoming donated embryos into your fertility clinic. So as long as you can show this is our process, we have a process that we follow. If the embryos did test, or if the donors did test positive for anything, this is how we advise the patient of all risks. You want that in writing to show, if you were ever checked out by the FDA, to show, okay, we're not just handling this on a case-by-case basis. We have a system and a program in place that is responsible, that cares for the well-being of the patient and is consistent with the values of fully educating clients on all risks associated with that. You can take some of the legal burden off of yourself by either having the family work with a family attorney to complete the donation contract, or with an agency such as ours to complete the donation contract that transfers the ownership of the embryos from the donor family to the intended parents. You are going to want that paper trail there to show that the embryos legally now belong to the intended parents and not the donor family anymore. Those are a few of the steps you can take to make sure that you are being compliant at your fertility clinic. And if you'd like, we can also set up a time to talk individually about what you're thinking as far as your clinic program and discuss the specifics of that case. Just a few more. Is there a religious background requirement for donating or recipient parents? In our program, no. We are completely driven by the desires of the donor family. So as I mentioned, the donor family is the one setting the preferences. They can set a preference for anything from income level, education, or religious background. We work with families from all different walks of life, and as long as the donor family is comfortable with the adoptive family that's receiving those embryos, we will facilitate that match. Okay. And then the final question I'm seeing is, if you see that embryos are not of excellent quality, what kind of counsel do the recipient parents receive regarding the chances of success before they formally adopt the embryos? As I mentioned, all of those records are sent over to their fertility clinic beforehand, before the family agrees to accept the match, before we do any legal contracts transferring the ownership. And we ask the family to meet with their physician and discuss their probability of success with them beforehand so they can make an educated decision. We want them to talk with their fertility specialist specifically, because their fertility specialist is going to know in more detail their medical history and be able to advise them on their specific chances of success based on the embryos they're receiving. So they have the option, and actually it's a requirement, that they clear the embryo set with their fertility clinic before they accept the match. So that's a step we take to make sure the families are well educated on what their chances of success are before they accept the match. I believe that's it. I'm not seeing any more questions coming up.
Okay, I am not seeing any either. So I am going to go ahead and close it up. It's a little bit early, which should be nice for everybody on their busy work day. So I just want to thank everybody for joining us today, and we really appreciate you coming and just being able to educate yourself on this important topic. If you have any questions, you can always email me a little bit later as well at deb@nightlight.org. And again, thank you so much for joining us today.